He never blinked beneath the crown, never heard his own name, never tasted air without the scent of power. On the 15th of November, 1316, bells rang through Paris like the heavens themselves had opened. "A king is born," they cried. But behind the velvet curtains of the royal bedchamber, something was wrong. He didn't cry, not at first, not like a child should. They placed him on silk in a cradle carved from gold, surrounded by priests, midwives, guards, but no mother to hold him. She lay still, pale, broken. Jean of Burgundy, fading after labor. 5 days. That's all they gave him. John, King of France from the moment he drew breath. Dead before his lips could form a single word. Was it illness or something more? Because one man stood just beyond the torchlight, waiting for the cradle to go quiet. And when it did, he took the throne. But what really happened inside that room of velvet and shadow? Who murdered the boy king? And why does history still hesitate to speak his name? The boy was never meant to be born into silence. He was the final breath of a dying dynasty. The last legitimate heir to a crown soaked in ambition, betrayal, and blood. To understand the tragedy of John I, we must first go back to a throne already cracking and a kingdom desperate for a future. Paris, June 1316. King Louis X, known to his people as Louis the Quarrelsome, had just died unexpectedly. He was only 26. Tall, proud, reckless. His heart stopped in the middle of a summer game of jeu de paume. Poison, some whispered. Heat stroke, others claimed. But no one dared say what they truly feared. That France was now without a king. And worse, without a son, because Louis's first child was a daughter, Marie, born of a wife now imprisoned for adultery. Illegitimate in the eyes of law and church. The throne could not pass to her, not yet. Not while men still ruled by swords and sons. But Louis had remarried to Jean of Burgundy, and at the time of his death, Jean was pregnant. The future of France, its crown, its wars, its very name, hung on the belly of a widow. "If it's a boy," said the court, "he shall be king." Not will be, shall be. Because the law demanded it. Because the bloodline insisted. Because the throne feared what would happen otherwise. And so the palace waited with bated breath. Midwives were summoned. Priests blessed the womb. Guards were posted outside Jean's door day and night. And every heartbeat inside that room echoed through the halls of Europe. The unborn child was already a symbol of continuity, of divine right, of everything France had fought to protect since Charlemagne. But the kingdom did not wait quietly. Ambition grows loud in the silence of power, and in the shadows, a man circled. Philip, Duke of Poitiers, younger brother to the late king, uncle to the unborn. He swore loyalty, promised guardianship, claimed he would protect the child should it be male. But not everyone believed him, because Philip had eyes like steel and fingers that itched for the orb and scepter. In court, they called him the loyal brother. In taverns, they whispered, "He wants the baby to die." And so, France waited. 8 long months. As Jean grew weaker, as Philip grew stronger, he began attending councils in the king's absence, signed proclamations, ordered soldiers. He even moved into the royal residence. He said he was preparing for the child's arrival, but others feared he was preparing for its absence. Then, on November 15, 1316, the silence shattered. A cry, a high, shrill, newborn cry. The court erupted. The bells of Notre Dame rang without pause. A boy, a son, a king. His name was John, John I, King of France, from the moment he was born. The first and only Capetian king to rule from the cradle. But not all rejoiced. Philip's face, they say, did not move, not even a twitch. He bowed before the crib, lips tight, and that very night he summoned his allies, spoke in hushed tones, gave orders no one heard. Because from that moment on, every breath the baby took was a threat to Philip's future. For 5 days, the child lay in a velvet-lined cradle, attended by midwives, guarded by priests. But no one, not even the Queen Mother, was allowed to hold him. Why? They said it was for his safety. Too fragile, too precious. But some said he was never meant to be touched, only seen, like a relic, like a candle waiting to go out. On the morning of November 20th, the palace grew quiet. No bells, no fanfare. A whisper crept through the halls. The child is dead. No cause given. No physician called. No mourning procession announced. The King of France was gone, and in his place, Philip, crowned not a week later. Some say the baby died naturally, that he was too weak to live, but others, many others, never believed that. Because when power shifts too smoothly, and grief looks rehearsed, and no body is shown, something has been hidden. John White of France was buried without ceremony. No tomb, no monument, no prayers in the streets, just a name and a crown that never even fit his head. There is a sound the royal walls remember, a sound that's softer than a cry, but sharper than a blade. A whisper, not from servants, not from priests, but from within the very heart of the palace. It began on the night the baby was born. The child's breath was shallow. Doctors said nothing. Midwives were pale with silence. And the Queen, Jeanne of Burgundy, was too weak to ask. But the others noticed. His skin too pale, his limbs too still, his eyes never opening fully. He had been crowned in theory, but not even baptized in the eyes of God. And in medieval France, a soul unbaptized was not just vulnerable, it was disposable. One midwife later claimed, in a letter burned before it reached the archives, that the baby had not moved since dawn. But the nursemaid was ordered to smile, to hold him still, to hush the rumors, because outside the chamber, France believed it had a king. Inside, they weren't so sure. He doesn't make noise, one whispered. He doesn't blink. Is he alive? The door stayed closed. The torchlight flickered lower each day. Priests came and went with no answer, and Philip waited. The Duke of Poitiers had not been idle. He held secret meetings. He secured alliances. He had the loyalty of the Paris Guard and the papal emissary. Most importantly, he had the support of France's most powerful legal minds. Because here lay the crack in the cradle. What if the child had never been alive? What if he had died in the womb? Or worse, what if the infant was not truly the king's, What if someone, perhaps a desperate widow or a cunning noblewoman, had presented a child to secure the throne, a child who was not born of royal blood? It sounds absurd now, but in the courts of 1316, where crowns were passed like chalices, such whispers were lethal. A rumor can kill faster than a sword, and these rumors began to grow teeth. One said the child had been swapped at birth. Another claimed he had been stillborn, and the palace was hiding a doll. The most chilling? That he was born healthy. But someone had stopped his breath while he slept. Philip never denied the rumors. He didn't need to. He simply allowed them to spread. And with every rumor, the cradle grew colder. Then came the strange acts. On the third day of the child's life, a royal clerk requested to see the baby. He was turned away. On the fourth day, a bishop scheduled a baptism. It was canceled because they said the child was too delicate. But how delicate must a child be to fear holy water? Some say the baby was dead before day 5, that he had been dead for days, that the body in the cradle was not breathing but merely displayed, a puppet for the people. And the mother? Jean's lips moved, but her voice never came back. Some claimed she asked for her son, but was told he was sleeping again and again. She never saw him after birth. Imagine, you give life to a king, and you're not allowed to hold him. Not once. Not to feed, not to kiss, not to bury. Because somewhere, someone had decided this baby was not a prince. He was a problem, and problems disappear. But one man saw through it. Guillaume de Nogaret, a loyal servant of the Capetian line, wrote in his diary, "They say the child is sleeping, but I passed his chamber last night. There was no sound, no nurse, no torch, only stillness, and the kind of quiet that makes bones ache." He died 2 weeks later. Heart failure, they said, at age 42. And then came the strangest twist. A letter from a merchant in Avignon to his cousin in Burgundy, written 5 years after the death of John I. It read, "You remember the baby in the cradle of gold? The one they said died? A boy arrived in Avignon last week. He bears a striking resemblance to the old king. They say he has royal eyes." Was it a hoax, a fantasy, or proof that the baby had been smuggled out and someone else buried in his place? The church burned the letter, but not before a copy survived. No one knows if the baby was truly John I. But one thing is certain. A 5-day-old king is easy to erase. No friends, no followers, no memories. Only a name written in ink that can fade with time or fire. And someone, somewhere, wanted him gone. Not later, not someday. Immediately. No thunder, no sword drawn, no rebellion in the streets. The greatest coup in French history didn't happen with armies, but with silence. It happened at night, in a room lit only by 2 candles, with a child too weak to cry, or perhaps already too quiet. The official record said, November 20th, 1316, 5 days after birth. John III, King of France, died. The cause? Unknown illness. The witnesses? 2 priests, 1 midwife. But no baptism, no public viewing, no royal mourning procession. Even his mother was not present. Jean of Burgundy was too ill to rise from bed, too broken to ask why no one placed her son in her arms. They wrapped the child in linen, did not anoint him, did not place the orb or scepter near his body. They buried him before dawn, beneath a slab with no inscription, a king without a name. But the silence did not last long, because in the early hours that followed the burial, the halls of the Louvre echoed with new footsteps. Philip, younger brother of the late king, Duke of Poitiers, now regent no more. That morning, he declared before the royal council, "The throne is vacant. The child is gone. France must not remain leaderless. I, Philip, will assume the crown." Some protested. A few whispered too soon. Others said nothing, because fear has a face, and it looked like Philip. He wore black, but not for mourning. It looked more like armor. The Archbishop of Reims raised no objection. Neither did the nobles who stood to gain by his rule. That same week, the Parliament of Paris issued a decree. Women shall not inherit the throne of France. Why? Because Philip feared the next in line, Louis XII's daughter Marie. She was still alive, still breathing. But now, disqualified. The line had been drawn, and the past buried. But not everyone obeyed. In the south of France, word spread that the baby king had not died, but been hidden. Some believed a wet nurse had smuggled him out. Others claimed Philip had switched the infant in the cradle for another child, already dying. Pamphlets appeared in Avignon and Toulouse. Where is the true son of Louis X? Philip ordered them burned. But rumors don't die in fire. They grow in shadow. Inside the palace, something darker unfolded. One of the midwives, her name lost to time, was found drowned in the Seine just weeks after the burial. Her body showed signs of bruising. Her mouth was tied shut with cloth. No investigation was conducted. The official word? A tragic fall. Another servant was sent to a monastery. No charges, no trial, just vanished. One bishop wrote in his diary, "God have mercy on France. We have traded a lamb for a lion." Still, Philip pressed forward. His coronation was held in Reims, the same cathedral where the boy king was supposed to be anointed. Instead, the oil touched Philip's brow. The people watched in silence. Some say they wept, not for joy, but for the boy who should have stood there. In his first act as king, Philip issued a declaration. "Let it be known that John, child of Louis X, ruled for 5 days. Let history remember him, but let France move forward." But history did not remember, because soon after, Philip had the baby's name removed from certain scrolls, removed from ceremonial texts, removed from prayers. The child's reign was now only a footnote, but the whispers continued. One night, Sir Henri de Vienne was said to have smuggled a sealed letter from the Queen Mother. Inside, a plea. "They did not let me hold him. Not once. I believe they stole him from me." Sir Henri died in a hunting accident 2 months later. His horse tripped. The rider's neck snapped. Or so the story goes. No letter was ever recovered. And so the kingdom went on. Philip the Tall ruled for 6 years. France prospered, at least on the surface. But the people had not forgotten the cradle. The golden cradle that arrived in Reims, empty. Because that cradle had been made for a king. A real one. One who never sat, never spoke, never stood, but still reigned. For 5 days. And there was one final wound. Years later, when Philip died, He was buried in the royal necropolis at Saint-Denis. Surrounded by kings, true and false, but nowhere in all the marble and inscriptions was there a monument to John. Only dust and the faint memory of a child whose cry still echoes in the stone. He had taken the crown, but not the silence, because somewhere in France, people still whispered what really happened. In the cradle of gold, you can silence a cry, you can bury a body, you can burn a name from the page, but you cannot erase a ghost. And the ghost of John Anichiwas refused to stay dead. For a while, Philip thought he had won. France accepted his rule. The clergy bowed. The nobles drank to his health. The cradle was gone. The child buried. The rumors fading. But beneath the stone floors of the Louvre, beneath the very dais where Philip placed his throne, the air had changed. There were whispers again. But this time, they had names, faces, and questions. It began in the provinces. A monk in Lyon claimed he saw a boy, about 6 years old, bearing the royal birthmark of the Capuchin line. He had the same eyes as Louis X, the same pale brow, the same unblinking stare. The monk wrote to the Archbishop of Sens, "This child is not of the village. He speaks little, but walks like he was taught to be watched. He calls himself Jean." The letter never reached its recipient. The monk was dead within the month. Fever, they said. But monks do not hang themselves from cellar beams when they are sick with fever. Then came the songs. Children in Bordeaux began to hum a lullaby no one had taught them. King in cradle, born in gold, sleeps where secrets can't be told. Eyes like winter, skin like flame. Say his name, say his name. The bishop there banned the song, but it spread like wind, and like wind, it carried fire, because the people had not forgotten. And more importantly, they did not forgive. Some began to speak openly. Pamphlets returned, this time with drawings. One depicted a child behind bars. Another showed Philip holding a dagger over a bassinet. Another had no words, just a golden cradle filled with bones. The crown struck back. Printers were arrested. Scribes disappeared. But for every voice silenced, two rose louder. The ghost of the 5-day king had become a symbol, not of monarchy, but of betrayal. He became the child of all France, the son who never grew, the king who never ruled, the innocent devoured by ambition. And Philip? He was now no longer a regent, but a thief, a usurper, a killer, if not of the body, then of memory. Then came the nobility. Not all nobles had loved Philip. Many had served Louis XI loyally, and they began to form quiet circles, sharing stories, forging pacts, asking the same question: what if the true king still lives? They met in wine cellars, in stables, in empty chapels just before dawn. They spoke in riddles, wrote in codes, used names that no longer existed. One circle called themselves les mères, the mothers, in honor of Jeanne of Burgundy and all mothers who lost children to the throne. Their motto was simple: he breathed, we remember. Philip knew. He knew from the moment his spies brought him a coin, newly minted in Marseille. On one side a fleur-de-lis, on the other a child's face. Not his, not Louis', but someone else. Young, unknown, and crowned. He summoned the parliament, declared such acts treason, issued new laws against slander, sedition, and reign fiction. But the damage had been done, because the fear was no longer of rebellion. It was of a return. One noble, Count Theobald of Champagne, was arrested for plotting to locate and crown the true heir. They tortured him for 14 days. He confessed to seeing the child in Avignon, said the boy had been smuggled there as a baby, hidden by monks loyal to Jeanne. He claimed he had a letter from the Queen Mother herself. They burned the letter. They burned Theobald, too. But not before he screamed, "You may kill me, but the king still breathes." From that day on, Philip stopped smiling in public. His court became guarded, the halls darker, the windows shuttered, even in summer. He feared mirrors, refused to see infants, forbade cradles in court, and most chilling of all, he banned the name John from being spoken in the palace, not just in reference to the king, but in any form. He erased the word because it reminded him that ghosts do not forget, but the people remembered. So did the poets, the artists, the mothers, the children. In paintings, they began to hide golden cradles in corners. In church hymns, the fifth line was always sung soft, as if holding breath for a boy who never cried. A shoemaker in Dijon carved a symbol into his door, a cradle beneath a crown. When asked what it meant, he only replied, "Justice or memory, whichever arrives first." By the 3rd year of Philip's reign, his advisors begged him to address the rumors, to hold a public inquiry, to clear his name. But he refused. To investigate the child was to admit he existed, and to admit he existed was to risk everything. Because if John had lived even just a few hours longer, then Philip had stolen the throne, and all laws, all decrees, all taxes, all wars were illegitimate. So instead, he clung to silence, even as it devoured him. He began to have dreams, woke up screaming, spoke of a face without eyes, a baby with no voice, a crown that bled when touched. He ordered the cradle destroyed, the one that had held John. It was burned in a courtyard at night, but someone had carved into it before it burned. He reigned. He burned the cradle. He silenced the name, but something had already taken root. And what grows from silence is rarely loyal. There is a moment when silence begins to speak, not with words, but with weight. A pressure behind the eyes, a coldness in the spine. That was the silence that began to surround King Philip V. Not the silence of victory, but of suspicion. He had taken the crown. He had erased the name. He had burned the cradle. But what he could not erase was the way people looked at him. The stares, the brief hesitations before bowing, the way even his own guards no longer called him Your Grace with full conviction. Because something had shifted, not in the people, not in the church, but in the throne itself. Philip sat on wood carved for another, wore robes stitched for a child that never grew. He was a king, but the kingdom had become cold to him. His decrees passed, but fewer clapped. His banquets were served, but no one lingered. And then, his body began to fail. It started with tremors. His left hand shook. He claimed it was stress, but when it spread to his jaw, when he could no longer hold a goblet without spilling wine down his chin. He began to worry. He consulted doctors, astrologers, monks. They told him what he already feared. "It is not your body, my king. It is your soul." The word they dared not speak was madness. But Philip heard it in their eyes. He locked himself in his chamber for days, refused audiences, refused light, refused the mirror. Because when he looked, he saw someone else. Someone smaller, crowned, and breathless. Jean of Burgundy died not long after, the mother of John Muffers. She never recovered after childbirth, but some say it was grief that killed her. In her final days, she spoke only one word, Jean, over and over, as if praying, as if begging the heir to return him. Philip did not attend her funeral. He claimed illness. But some say he feared that even the dead might speak against him. Then came the court betrayals. A chamberlain, loyal for years, was caught whispering that perhaps Philip had rushed to the crown too eagerly. He was imprisoned, but never tried, because trials require evidence, and Philip no longer trusted paper, or ink, or voices. He trusted only the sound of his own heartbeat, and even that was starting to betray him. By the 5th year of his reign, Philip had become a shadow of himself. He slept in different chambers every night, feared poisoning, feared knives in the dark, feared children. Yes, children. He once saw a page boy with pale eyes and screamed for the boy to be removed. The boy's name? Jean. The palace staff began to whisper again. The king no longer rules. He wanders. He talks to the walls. One maid claimed she found him curled beneath the throne one morning, clutching a blanket, muttering, "He's still here. He's watching me." Even the church grew cold. The Bishop of Tours publicly referred to John there as our lost monarch. Philip demanded retraction. The bishop refused. And for the first time in Philip's reign, the church did not side with the king. Because the church too had started to wonder, what if the soul we ignored was the one God had chosen? Then came the vision. On the night of the 5th anniversary of John's death, Philip ordered all candles in the palace extinguished. He sat alone in the council chamber. No guards, no wine, no prayers, only silence. What he saw that night, no one knows. But he emerged pale, mouth slightly open, eyes unfocused. He did not speak for 3 days, and when he did, he said only, "I was never king." From that day forward, he ceased holding court. He allowed ministers to govern. He stayed in his room, drawing circles on parchment, staring at walls, whispering names no one else could hear. Some say he tried to abdicate, that he summoned his council and declared, "The true king still breathes. I am but a placeholder." But no document was signed. No official act passed, because to abdicate was to admit, and admission was death. He died the following year, at the age of 28. The official record says, a fever. But some claim they found him on the floor. Nails dug into his own chest, lips blue, eyes wide, as if he'd seen something, or someone. Something small, silent, royal. No morning bells rang for Philip, no songs, no tears, only a whisper carried from mouth to mouth. The throne is clean again. But was it? Because even in death, his story was not truly his. It still belonged to the baby, the king who never sat, never ruled, but who still remained. Philip died, but not as a king. He died as a man haunted, not by armies, but by a child whose breath was stolen in silence. History remembers kings by their monuments, by the marble they leave behind, by the bells that toll when they die. But John de France had no marble, no bells, no name carved in stone, because the boy who was born a king was buried like a secret. They say he died on the 5th day, in a room no one could enter, in arms no one saw. The church recorded the event in a single sentence. The child passed into God's hands. No baptism, no eulogy, no procession through the streets of Paris, just silence, and the early morning sound of dirt falling on linen. There was no monument raised in Saint-Denis, no statue in the royal gardens, no shrine in the chapel. For centuries, tourists passed through the royal tombs, counting kings, reading epitaphs, tracing names with reverent fingers. But between Louis X and Philip V, there is a gap, a breath that never finished. One historian wrote, "In the royal records, there is a pause, a skipped line, a name that was never allowed to become a story." And that was the most powerful erasure of all. Not execution, not exile, but forgetfulness. His mother, Jeanne, was buried beside her husband, but no one knows where her child lies. Some claim the body was placed in an unmarked crypt beneath a side altar in Saint-Denis. Others say he was buried outside the city, under cover of night, far from the light of royal rites. A rumor even spread that his body was never buried at all, that it was burned to destroy every trace. Centuries later, when restorers opened ancient tombs, they found bones, tiny, fragile, unlabeled. They studied them, dated them, speculated, but in the end, they reburied them, without answers, without names, because no one could say with certainty, this was John. And in France, no one dared ask anymore. The question was too dangerous, too late, too lost. He became a rumor, then a ghost, then a shadow on the page. Textbooks did not include him. Paintings skipped over his cradle. Chronicles wrote his name, then scratched it out. Some even called him the Phantom King, a child who reigned only in theory, a monarch erased before he could leave a mark. But memory is stubborn, and grief lingers. In Burgundy, mothers began to whisper his name over cribs when their babies cried at night. Jean le Roi, sleep now, sleep safe. They sang lullabies for a boy who never heard his own. In rural churches, a single candle was lit every year on November 20th. No plaque, no explanation, just flame and silence. And still, his face reappeared, not in portraits, not in records, but in dreams. Artists claimed to see him in visions, pale cheeks, eyes wide, lips not yet strong enough to speak. One monk painted a child behind a veil. In his notes he wrote, "He does not speak, but he watches." Centuries passed. Kings came and went. France bled, burned, crowned, collapsed. But the silence of John remained, and that silence spoke louder than drums. In 1793, during the desecration of royal tombs in the French Revolution, graves were opened, bones scattered, crowns shattered. But no one found John, because to find him, they would have had to admit he existed. And by then, France had already forgotten. Or had it? Because in 2002, a French historian named Charles Dupont was studying letters from the Avignon archives. In the margins of a forgotten scroll, he found a sketch. Not a drawing, but a sigil. A child's head inside a crown. And below it, in Latin, he was king, even if none remember. He published the find, but received threats. Letters signed with names lost to time. He stopped speaking about it, but one sentence in his journal survived. The danger is not that they will kill me. The danger is that they will silence him again. And so John remains, in the cracks, in the spaces between names, in the places where stories stop without ending, because there is no statue, no song, no scream, only this: a throne made for a child, a cradle lined with gold, and the sound of history holding its breath for 5 days. He had no crown, no tomb, no mourners, but he had something far more dangerous: a story, one they tried to bury, but that refused to die. In history, there are 2 ways to kill a man. One is with steel, the other is with silence. John I of France did not bleed. He did not fall in battle. He was not exiled, tried, or condemned. He simply vanished, from breath, from cradle, from memory. And when he was gone, those who gained from his death set about erasing the evidence that he was ever there. Not out of hate, but out of fear, because nothing is more dangerous to a fragile throne than the memory of a rightful king. It began with the Chronicles. In the royal account books of 1316, there is an entry: November 15th, the child is born. November 20th, the child is passed. But in copies made after 1320, the dates are smudged, rewritten, the ink reapplied. In some, the entries disappear altogether, and in others, the name John is replaced with a simple phrase. The issue was unresolved. Not dead, not stillborn, just unresolved. The royal scribe at the time, Etienne de Miremont, was dismissed quietly. His replacement, a man named Gerard, never wrote the name Jean again in any official document. The archives of the Parliament of Paris were revised in 1322. A new copy of the royal lineage was commissioned. It listed Philip IV, Louis X, Philip V. No John, no explanation, a missing heartbeat between kings, but the most damning evidence of deliberate erasure comes from the royal church itself. In the Cathedral of Notre Dame, a book of prayers was kept for every monarch, a tradition since Hugh Capet. When opened today, you will find a candle for Louis, a page for Philip, a Latin psalm for Charles. But between November 1316 and January 1317, there is a gap, a page torn out, clean, precise, not a stain, not a note, as if someone used a knife to cut away the memory of a child. And yet, for all these deletions, some memories refuse to die. A Venetian ambassador named Marco Baldi visited the French court in 1320. In his notes, he wrote, "They speak of a boy born king, but his name is not said aloud. It hovers in the air like incense no one lit." He later claimed he was warned never to speak of it again. "Your tongue may be Italian," one courtier told him, "but your neck is French while you're here." Even in art, the erasure was subtle, but effective. A series of tapestries woven for Philip V's court depicted the Tree of Kings. Each monarch was shown as a branch, but one branch was tied with black ribbon, unlabeled, unspoken. A visitor once asked, "What does this black branch mean?" The weaver replied, "It was once a sprout, but it was cut before it could bloom." In law, the deletion was codified. The Salic law, reaffirmed in 1317, declared that only males could inherit the throne. But more importantly, it made no mention of male children dying in infancy. This allowed the crown to skip over John without ever saying his name. He became, legally, a moment of silence, not a monarch. And yet, there were those who remembered. A monk in Rouen wrote, "He reigned, however briefly, and that reign, no matter how short, was real. A crown touches the head. It does not ask how long it will stay." But his writings were banned, his manuscript confiscated, his name struck from the monastery roll. He became like the boy he mourned, forgotten by decree. What makes this erasure so terrifying is not just its cruelty, but its effectiveness. Generations of French children were taught a history in which John I never existed. Textbooks printed in the 1600s, 1700s, even the 1900s skipped from Louis VI directly to Philip V. And when a child asked, "What happened in between?" the answer was always the same. Nothing. But memory, leaks, a whisper in Avignon, a scratched stone in Burgundy, a lullaby in Tours. King in cradle, born in gold. 5 days passed, no hand to hold. These fragments survived not in books, but in breath. Mothers passed them down, quietly, privately, because they remembered something history was afraid to say out loud, that a life does not need length to deserve mourning. And the greatest cruelty? That when monuments were built to honor the kings of France, John's was never among them. Even during the Renaissance, when memory was reclaimed, John was not. His cradle, once gold-trimmed and velvet-lined, was stripped, repurposed, and eventually burned. His name became dangerous. To speak it was to question the throne. To write it was to invite investigation. To believe it was to risk treason. And so his story died. Not with him, not even with Philip, but with the scribes, the artists, the priests, with every pen that hesitated over the letter J and moved on, with every tongue that paused before Jean and chose silence instead. And yet, even now he is not truly gone, because in every history book with a missing year, he lingers. In every archive with a torn page, he waits. He's not missing. He is hidden, not dead, not erased, just waiting. For someone to say what France never dared admit, that for 5 days, France had a king. And then it had shame. They rewrote the records. They removed his name. But they forgot one thing. You cannot erase a question. And John I was a question the crown could never answer. He was buried in silence, erased from law, scratched from ink, denied a tomb, a crown, a prayer. But not even history can keep a child quiet forever. Centuries passed, and France forgot. Wars came, kings died, empires collapsed. Blood flowed from the Bastille to the Somme, and still no one spoke of John I, until someone did. In 1825, a French historian named Émile de Clercq was sorting through a collection of royal manuscripts when he found something odd. A copy of a genealogy. Old, fragile, ink faded with age. It listed Louis X, John Wache, reigned 5 days. Philip V, There it was, a single line, small, in parentheses. But there, Emile circled it, and beneath it he wrote, "So he did exist." That moment, one circle of ink, became the first whisper of a long-forgotten scream. In 1831, a playwright named Hugo Bresson read Emile's paper. Haunted by the image of a king who died before being kissed, he wrote a tragedy. Jean, le roi perdu, John, the lost king. The play opened in a small theater in Lyon. Only 20 people came on opening night. But by the third week, they had to turn audiences away. It was not a political play. It was not about thrones or power. It was about a child and a kingdom that could not love him in time. One scene became infamous. A wet nurse tries to hush the child, but he will not stop crying. Then the lights dim, and when they rise again, she is rocking an empty blanket. No sound, just breath, and the sound of a crown falling on stone. From that night on, France remembered him differently. He was no longer a mistake, no longer a rumor. He was a ghost, but a ghost with a name. In the 20th century, more signs of his memory emerged. A painting by Claire Delacroix in 1919 showed a golden cradle floating above a battlefield. She called it Le Roi Jamais Vu, the king never seen. In it, the cradle casts no shadow. Because, as she explained, you cannot bury what was never held. During World War II, resistance fighters used code names to protect their identities. One commander in the Free French Army signed every message as Jean, the 5e jour, John, the 5th day. When asked why, he replied, "Because 5 days is enough to deserve a country that remembers." In 1976, the Louvre hosted an exhibit titled The Forgotten Monarchs of France. It was the first time in modern state history that John I was officially included in a royal lineage timeline. No portrait, no artifacts, just a plaque. John Royce, King of France, reigned 5 days, lived in silence, died in silence, but not forgotten. Visitors wept, not out of pity, but out of recognition. Because in that blank space between kings, they saw not a void, but a child. And then came the most mysterious revival of all. In 2008, an amateur historian named Léa Martel was exploring a monastery ruin in southern France. Behind a broken wall, in a sealed alcove, she found a box. Inside, a cloth bundle, wrapped with care. And in the bundle, a carved wooden emblem, a cradle, crowned, marked with a single word, Jean. Carbon dating placed the artifact at around 1320. There was no note, no explanation, just a symbol, left where someone once hid truth in hope that time would not. Today, the emblem sits in the Musée de Cluny, in a glass case, next to a bronze plaque that reads, "Not all kings sit on thrones. Some sleep in shadows, waiting to be remembered." Universities now teach him. Children now learn his name. Writers invoke him as metaphor. Mothers still whisper his lullaby. Jean, petit roi, né pour pleurer, mais pas assez longtemps pour qu'on t'entende. John, little king, born to cry, but not long enough to be heard. He has become more than a king. He has become a question, a symbol, a wound that history closed, but never healed. And perhaps that is his true reign, not 5 days, but 5 centuries of unfinished memory. He rules not in gold, but in absence, not in power, but in myth. And myths, unlike monarchs, do not die. He did not leave behind a crown. He left a story. And now that story lives in art, in song, in the silence where history finally learns to listen. There are kings who ruled for decades. They built castles, signed treaties, fought wars. History remembers them. Names etched in marble, statues casting long shadows. But there is another kind of king, one who never held a scepter, never spoke to his people, never even opened his eyes to the sky. And yet, his story speaks louder than all the proclamations carved in stone. John, I reigned for 5 days. That's all. 5 dawns, 5 dusks, 5 soft heartbeats inside a palace that was too afraid to love him. He was born into expectation, burdened with legacy, crushed beneath ambition before he ever learned what a crown was. He did not fail as a king, he was failed by the world around him, by a system that saw him as a threat, not a child, by men who feared what he represented: truth, blood, and a power that could not yet defend itself. But perhaps his greatest tragedy was not his death. It was the silence that followed, because the world chose not to grieve him, but to forget him. And yet, some memories refuse to die. They survive in lullabies, in dusty pages, in broken cradles and faded initials carved into cathedral stones. John was not a symbol of power. He became a symbol of vulnerability, of the lives erased because they are inconvenient, because they are small, because they are silent. But silence is not absence. Silence is a presence we have not yet learned to name. In remembering John I, we are not just restoring a lost monarch to a forgotten lineage. We are reminding ourselves that even the shortest lives have weight. Even the quietest names can shake empires. That value is not measured in days lived or crowns worn, but in the space a life creates between the heartbeat and the silence that follows. He was king, not because he ruled, but because he mattered. So next time you read a history book and see a missing line, an unexplained gap, a child mentioned in passing, ask who they were. Ask what they were denied. Ask why no one stayed long enough to tell their story. Because somewhere, in the space between kings, a child once breathed for 5 days. And that was enough. To me, the story of John I is not just about monarchy. It's about the fragility of human worth in a world that values power over presence. He was a child, a heartbeat, a breath that barely touched the air. And yet, that was enough to terrify kings, enough to make history flinch, enough to be erased, deliberately. What does it say about us when a 5-day-old child must be silenced because the truth of his existence threatens the order of an empire? And what does it say about memory that centuries later, we still search for his name in the shadows? John reminds me that history is not only written by victors, it is also shaped by those we choose to forget. And in choosing to remember him today, we make a small act of justice. We return voice to a child who was never given the chance to speak. To remember John is to remember every life lost too soon, every voice never heard, every child made invisible by power. And that is worth everything. If this story moved you, not because of the crown, but because of the silence, then share it. Let John I be remembered not as a ghost in the margins, but as a child who taught us that every life, even the briefest, deserves to echo.